All right. So we're basically working through looking at the English translations. And does anybody remember the last translation that we talked about? Okay, you weren't supposed to remember it. That was the joke I was setting up. You were supposed to say, I don't remember. That was a long time ago. And I would say, yeah, most people don't remember it because it really wasn't that big of a translation. Remember, it was overshadowed before it even was published, the Taverner Bible. But we have looked at so far, especially the Great Bible, which was a compilation of the various ones, such as the Tyndale New Testament and some other writings that are out there. The Coverdale Bible and the Great Bible kind of was, well, the Great Bible of its day until, as we will talk about today, certain events took place. To get, though, to where we need to be, we have to do at least a little bit of historical, cultural, contextual setting. So we're going to talk about some things that were taking place in England during this time, what we would call the English Reformation, or what's going on through this time. And really, Henry VIII is the first major figure of this. Henry VIII, when he was the king, he was an advocate for Protestantism, but he wasn't completely just on board. He didn't see the likes of Calvin or Luther, Zwingli, the things that they would have done. He didn't think that you should go that far out away from away from Catholicism. And so he really didn't want to push the agenda, but his right-hand man, Thomas Cromwell, did. He was 100% behind it and really ended up going too far in England because he tried to do in England what was done in Geneva with Calvin and in Germany and things such as that, and he tried to make England the same way. He abolished anything that looked Catholic. He took over all of the monasteries and kicked everybody out that would be in them, going into all the little towns and taking over all of the property of the Catholic Church and then selling it so that people could buy it and reappropriate it or reuse it. The church bought up some of it when they sold it. But this really was unpopular among the people because Englanders, the Englishmen, they are rather conservative people. And they like their simple life, and they like things not to change, and they don't want wholesale change to take place. And so the country folk, they cherished their small churches and the masses and things that they did. And so when Cromwell and his allies abolished all of the churches, expelled the priests, took over the land, doing all that type of stuff, there were some rebellions that started to crop up during this time because of the religious overreach. Also, another mistake that Cromwell made was convincing Henry VIII to marry Anne of Cleves. In 1539, Anne of Cleves was a princess in a Lutheran territory, and there were some issues going on in the mainland Europe. It looked as if the Catholic countries were starting to form a coalition, and they were starting to build up armies and ally against each other, against the Protestant nations. And so you had then this whole discussion coming up. If they created a Catholic alliance, and if they were to go to war against the Protestant nations, this would create an imbalance of power. England would get involved on the Protestant side. And Cromwell said, we need to make sure that we get ourselves involved in all of this. So the marriage of Anne of Cleves was supposed to have been a political marriage to tie in with other Protestant nations. Those threats on the continent never happened. There was never a war that broke out of an alliance of the Catholic nations against the Protestant nations. That never materialized. So in other words, this marriage wasn't even necessary. But not only that, Henry could not stand the woman. I mean, just despised, looked. It abhorred him completely. So much he couldn't even consummate the marriage for months after the marriage took place. He just couldn't get himself to do it. He hated her, despised her so much because he really wanted a pretty little young thing that had just been introduced into the court, a little 20-year-old that he was really excited about. That's who he wanted to bring to his bed and marry. So Cromwell was not looking good in Henry's eyes. People knew this. They took advantage of this, those who were adversaries to Cromwell, because he, while doing his things, had made some enemies as well. And so during all of this time, he finally got Henry against Cromwell. We haven't gotten to that just yet there. So there arose the anti-Cromwell faction. They took the opportunity to blame Cromwell for all the negativity that was going on in all of England. And in 1540, without a trial, anything like that, Henry VIII had Cromwell arrested and executed for treason against the state. So Cromwell ends up dying in 1540. And I say all of this to really bring in the fact that last week, it kind of sounded like everything was going hunky-dory for the Protestant movement in England, right? They had these Bibles that were coming out. The king was behind them, declaring that, hey, this is great, moving forward with it. Everything seemed to be going well. But really, by the end of his life, Henry VIII was regretting a lot of the choices that he had made to venture as far as he did toward Protestantism. In fact, in his very final, address before the Parliament, he said that he regretted that the Word of God was disputed, rhymed, sung, and jangled in every alehouse and tavern, spoken with tears coming from his eyes. So Henry dies in 1547, and 1547, his kind of sickly son, Edward VI, became king at the age of 10. Now, he's 10 years old, so he's not going to take the reins fully, completely as a king at this point. He'd been growing up, being raised under Protestant tutors, and he'd been given instruction not only with the English Bible, but also he'd been given instruction in Greek. He was a very pious, moral person. He took his Christianity very, very seriously. At a young age, he was known as someone who probably would have made a really good king. Unfortunately, his health failed him, and 6 years later, at the age of 16, before he ever really took the throne, his uncle had kind of declared himself the Lord Protectorate and had kind of taken the reins. So at the age of 16, he died of tuberculosis, and any hope of his reign came to an end. And again, his mother's brother had seized the throne, calling himself the Lord Protectorate, and he pushed forward many Protestant agendas. Anything that Henry had wanted to do that was pro-Catholic, this guy repealed all of them and really made everything as Protestant as it could be. Well, between 1547 and 1553, during the time that Edward was the king, the Great Bible went through 7 different editions, so they were continuing to work on it. Matthew's Bible Remember, by John Rogers had gone through 3 different editions during that time. They were continuing to work on and revise it. Coverdale's had gone through 2, and Tyndale's New Testament had gone through 35 different revisions or editions in that time. Also, remember Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. He worked on revamping the liturgical worship. This is when he created the Book of Common Prayer in 1549 with the help of others. And that itself went through a major revision in 1552. All right, so that brings us through Edward's time and how the New Testament, and well, the entire Bible in English, how all of that is progressing. Everything changes when Edward dies. Because after a brief struggle for succession, the rightful, based on bloodline, the way that they did it, the rightful successor was Mary, the daughter of Henry's first wife, because remember, there were no other male siblings. He only had the one son, Edward. So she became the rightful heir, and she was very decidedly not Protestant. She was Catholic through and through. She was militantly Catholic. Now, at first, she tried not to bend things too much. She didn't want to rock boats necessarily. But she started making some very pro-Catholic moves. And so when Mary took the throne, she married, first of all, Philip II of Spain. He was the soon-to-be, he was going to be the next king, and that was to create an alliance between England and Spain, Spain being one of the most Catholic countries that you could have during this time. And so she was creating an alliance with the Catholic Church through Edward in Spain. Through Philip II of Spain. There was also a short-lived coup attempt after she did this, a rebellion that took place, and she was very hostile to those who tried to oust her as the queen. And after that took place, her true colors then began to be seen. She said, if the Protestants are going to choose to be enemies, then I will be their enemy. In 1554, the new Pope, Julius, restored England to the fold of the Catholic nations, signifying that England was now a Catholic nation once again. And the English translation of the Bible pretty much just stopped happening during this time. Nobody was really printing them. It's not like there was an official ban per se, but everybody could read the room, and they knew you just don't do this right now. During this time, a persecution arose against anyone tied to Protestantism. During her short reign, roughly 400 people died under persecution. 280, very specifically, she sent to execution to be burned at the stake. Remember, we talked about John Rogers, the one who put together the Matthew's Bible. He was the very first one of those. So 280 were burned at the stake. And instead of really, as she, I think, was trying to do, instead of snuffing out Protestantism, just saying, look, you guys realize if you're going to come against us, we're going to completely destroy it. The intense persecution, as it often does, only furthered their resolve and strengthened the Protestant Reformation as a whole. Not only are people in England aware of what's going on, the people in continental Europe are watching the persecution. They're watching the suffering that's taking place, the martyrs. And at this point, they are holding up England as the example to follow of what to do when persecution comes. And so England kind of becomes the poster boy for Protestantism during this time. So the tide turns in England against Mary and Catholicism. She also got into a war with France, an unpopular war, and lost that war. And in 1558, having only been on the throne for 5 years, that's all that she was on the throne, grief-stricken, exhausted, having had all kinds of issues with pregnancies and such things, Mary dies in 1558. And the next in line after Mary was her half-sister, Elizabeth, the child of Anne Boleyn. And on her coronation day, let me see here, let me catch up here. So you have Elizabeth on her coronation day. She actually does a few things that are very Protestant. She has not only the Latin but the English Bible read at her coronation. They stopped the procession at one point so that someone can hand her a Bible in a certain way that was a dig at Mary and her reign before her. And so Mary was actually rather supportive of Protestants to begin with, but things are going to change at some point down the road. Before we get to that, though, just a few more things to say about Mary before we move into talking about the next Bible. Initially, she did not take an active stance one way or the other. She was not pro-Protestant or pro-Catholicism. I mean, she definitely, I guess you could say, she favored Protestantism. But she also liked the ritual, the pomp of the Catholic Church, and enjoyed that as well. In her long reign, she only, I guess you could say, officially executed. There were others we're going to see who die, but she only sent 4 to the stake to burn during her reign for religious reasons, and they were all Anabaptists. And are you all familiar with the Anabaptists? All right, so some of y'all, if there was a group, I think during the Reformation that we would look at and say, they really align well with us, it would be the Anabaptists, who incidentally were the most persecuted group of any, because they were hated not just by the Catholics, but by the Protestant reformers as well. Nobody liked the Anabaptists at all. Anabaptists, anybody know what that means? Yeah, baptized again. You know, those, because they supported or they said that you should have adult baptism. Baptism is something that you don't do to children, that adults choose to be baptized, and that was what got them into a lot of trouble, as well as some other things. All right. Questions or comments? I know I'm kind of, like I said, I'm wanting to get through a lot of material, and really some of this just doesn't lend itself to good discussion points, so I do apologize on that end. But does somebody want to make a comment on any of that before we start talking about the next English Bible that came out during this time? Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Yes, absolutely, and I'm not nearly as up to speed on pre-United States history as I was when I was like, 9, 10 years old, when I knew everything at that point in time. But yeah, so I can't give dates as far as like the Jamestown settlement and Plymouth and all of that type of stuff. But yeah, it's going to be around during the same time frame. We definitely know that there is, especially Spanish, folks over here, Portuguese, English, and French. I don't know if they've arrived and declared their spot just yet, but yeah, all of this, there's a whole world of stuff taking place. while this is happening back here as well. Yeah, very good. All right, well, let's talk about the next Bible. That is the Geneva Bible. During Mary's reign, there was a group of Protestants who fled England, and they knew that they were not welcome there, so they tried to seek out a place where they were welcome, and they found that place in Geneva. Why Geneva? What's that? Yeah, because that's Calvin. That is Calvin's city. Calvin basically took over the city of Geneva, and he made himself as the head guy during this time, and kind of, got to the point where he was the almost, you could say, dictator type leader of this place. But he has created a Protestant haven, a utopia of sorts, for those who are Protestants in Geneva. And so you have a group, actually a couple factions. There are a couple factions of English refugees. One group was led by a guy named Richard Cox, another group by a guy named John Knox. And these make their way over to Geneva because Calvin's established himself there. In Geneva, they reject Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer. They say it's too popish. So they create their own, a new Book of Common Prayer that is based on Calvin's, I must have taken that note out, that's based on Calvin's liturgy that he has. But in 1557, they begin to work on a new translation. In 1557, the New Testament is put out. In 1560, the Old Testament. This is largely based on the Great Bible, particularly for the Old Testament, and Tyndale they use for the New Testament. And this is, to this point in time, this is the most careful, scholarly work that's done. It was an achievement. During this time, the people that were working on this, and they were using the Hebrew and the Greek translations. For the first time, they are adding words in italics. How many of y'all have translations where there's these italicized words every now and then? And you look and you see the italicized word, and that just simply means they're adding in a word that the Greek doesn't necessarily have. But for the English to make sense, you really need it there, right? It's not adding to the word, it's just helping us understand the word better in our translation. This is the first time that they do that. Put italicized words in there to help us understand the meaning. This is the first time that the text was divided into chapter and verse in the English language. That hadn't been done with the English Bibles before. And really, this, because of the great achievement that it was, this becomes the standard Bible. Now, I said before that the Great Bible, was, it was fantastic, and it was used, and it was prominent for many, many years. Most prominent, though, in that it was the Bible used in the Book of Common Prayer that Cranmer put out, and it's going to be used, moving forward in that. But it is superseded by the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible is the main Bible that's going to be used by your standard Bible reading people, the common people, and for good reason. The Geneva Bible would go through 140 editions or revisions between 1560 and 1644. Now, what's significant about that date, 1644, as far as an English Bible is concerned that's still being used and revised and updated? Yeah, the King James is out, right? What year does the King James come out? 1611. So for about 30 years, 30 plus years after the King James is out, the Geneva Bible is still the one that people are using. And it's still in use, it's still being revised, people are still paying attention to it. Some of the notable phrases that we get from the Geneva Bible that are introduced for the first time: vanity of vanities was something from the Geneva. Except a man be born again. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth. My beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. A cloud of witnesses, and a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. These are English phrases that first show up in the Geneva Bible. So, though the Great Bible was the Bible quoted in the Book of Common Prayer that was used, the Geneva Bible really replaces it, and it becomes the main Bible for the people. It's not the last Bible, though, that we're going to see in the English language before the King James Version. In fact, the next one, which comes out just a few years after this, is the Bishop's Bible in 1568. The problem is that the notes in the Geneva Bible really slanted towards what group of people, would you think? Catholics or Protestants? Protestants. Very, very heavily Protestant. In fact, they're about as vehement against popish types of ways of doing things, Catholic ways of doing things, as you could possibly get. When it comes to the Church of England, the Anglican Church, they didn't accept the Pope, but how different was the Anglican Church from the Roman Catholic Church? Not a whole lot different. It maintained an awful lot of the same things, a lot of the same organization, the bishop system and priests and things like that. It's not a wholesale, complete change like what you see in Geneva, or in other places. So when you have all of these notes that talk about all of these bad things that are going on, there's going to be a whole lot of overlap between what they're criticizing about the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church. So this really rubs a lot of people the wrong way. Very specifically, what people? The higher-ups in the Anglican Church, the people who are in control, the bishops of the Anglican Church and such. And so you have all of these people, and really at this point in time, there's really there are two factions that are forming within the church in England. There is the High Church Anglicans, and then you have the Puritans. These are going to be two factions that are really going to fight against one another in various ways. And so the High Church leaders believed that the Geneva Bible just went too far. And they wanted a Bible that they could put into the hands of people that would do away with the Geneva Bible, one that was more pro the Anglican Church and less hostile to the way that they would do things. And so they were convinced that they had to have a Bible to use which did not contain all the Protestant rhetoric. Let's see here. Let me make sure I'm not skipping over anything. All right, so following the example of Cranmer, remember back when Cranmer was trying to put together the Great Bible, he put the translation responsibilities in the hands of bishops. And they said, that's a good idea. Why don't we break down the translation responsibilities among a whole bunch of bishops, which is, by the way, where we get the name the Bishop's Bible. If we put the translation in the hands of bishops, we're going to have as good a translation as we can get. Because remember, they're the ones who want to have the new translation. And they had certain rules that they were supposed to abide by. They were told to use the Great Bible and compare it to the original languages. So they start with the Great Bible. They were supposed, in times where they said, I don't know if the Great Bible has a great translation of this text, you're supposed to, the tiebreaker goes to the Latin text. So go back to the Latin text and say, how do they treat this? That'll help us. They were supposed to mark boring passages such as genealogies, let people know, hey, you're about to enter into a part that you may just want to skip, so that people could skip the boring sections if they wanted to. They also were supposed to remove crass language as language changes and word meaning changes. You may have some words that at one time were perfectly acceptable to say that now have a different meaning than what they once did. There were some examples that were given in Wide as the Waters, and I thought about throwing them out there, but they have words that probably would not be ones that I would normally say from up here, so I refrain from doing so. Because words change, word meaning changes. So they were supposed to remove some of that, and they were told not to put what was called bitter notes or high-level rhetoric. Like, why did they hate the Geneva Bible? Because the marginal notes were all about how bad the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church and how bad all of that was. They say, look, just stay away from that type of stuff. No slander, no polemic, just make good marginal notes instead. This has, right here, the makings of an incredible translation. Following all of these rules and doing all of that, it's put into the hands of great scholars. These bishops are all great scholars. You would think that this would be just an amazing translation, and instead it becomes a huge failure. The Bishop's Bible was a scholarly failure from top to bottom because many scholars worked on their translational sections, the parts that they were supposed to do, but apparently there was never any real connection between translators. They didn't talk to each other, or they never got together as a group and talked about a way to do translations and stuff. There is no consistency from bishop to bishop about style, word use, how to translate things, what to do. All you have is just a bunch of disjointed translations that don't sound alike. They don't sound like, there's one author that's kind of running through all of this. And apparently that goes on Cranmer, who proved to be a completely incompetent. I don't know why I put Cranmer. I'm like, that's not right. He's the guy that was with the Great Bible. This should be Matthew Parker. So if you are, I know all of you guys are just on the edge of your seat with every single word that I'm giving to you. So I know how difficult this is going to be for you to know that I messed this one up. Matthew Parker, though, not Cranmer. Matthew Parker is the guy he is the current Archbishop of Canterbury. He organized, he spearheaded the project, and he was not a good editor. He didn't put all of this together. There's no flow. There's nothing that brings this together. It was just not a well-done translation. The whole Bishop's Bible is kind of a failure because of that. And sometimes you just have really odd readings. Like in Ecclesiastes chapter 11, instead of cast your bread on the face of the waters, it's lay thy bread upon wet faces, which is a weird way to put that. And so there were some like, speak not evil of one another became backbite not one another. Just, weird choices to make because they're supposed to be following the Great Bible unless they see a good reason to change it. And what you find is they seem to be more saying, well, we're going to put our mark on this and changing things that may not need to be changed. Now, to be fair, we do get such phrases as the voice of one crying in the wilderness comes from the Bishop's Bible. Overcome evil with good. You see that for the first time here. and persecuted for righteousness' sake. There in the Beatitudes. That phrase is first found here. Though it was given to the queen, remember when the great Bible was completed, and even Matthew's Bible was completed, it was given to the king, who then made a declaration that this is good. After he gave it to the bishops, they checked it out and they said, yeah, it's good. Then the king makes a declaration that says this is well and good and should be read throughout England. They give it to her, and she does nothing with it. There is no official stance that is taken by the queen, and it did not win favor among the people. They saw this as the Bible that was trying to be pushed on them from the high church Anglicans, and they wanted nothing to do with it because they already had the Geneva Bible, and the Geneva Bible was superior to it. And so really this becomes an ultimate failure of a translation during this time. It was very expensive, so they didn't have a lot of people. It was big, so the commoner couldn't just carry it around with them. And in its lifetime of basically 42 years before they just kind of quit using it, it went through 22 editions and revisions. It was the official Bible. They put this Bible in the homes of the bishops, all the bishops of the church, and then they put the Bible in every church so that it could be read and used, but that's about it. It really didn't catch on beyond that. So, the last Bible to really talk about, and we're going to have to blow through a whole lot of information here, so I don't know if I need to go Micro Machines man here and try to get through this or what the case, but the last one is the Douay-Rheims, sometimes just called the Douay Bible, that was published in 1610. And this one, really the history behind this, during Elizabeth's reign, remember initially she didn't really side Protestant or Catholic. She kind of was ambivalent to begin with, but the Catholics really pushed her into siding one way or another. The Catholics really saw England as a crusade ground when Elizabeth took the throne, because Mary, remember, brought them back into the Catholic fold. Elizabeth took them immediately back out of it, and so now there was a desire to bring them back in. During the reign of Elizabeth, you have this problem, this tension in England, and this is when Philip II of Spain created an armada. Perhaps you've heard of the Spanish Armada, the defeat of the Spanish Armada that took place. The intent of that was an invasion of England to overthrow Elizabeth and to take Protestantism out and put a nice, good Catholic on the throne once again. That was what the Spanish Armada was all about. That's what it was trying to accomplish. During this time, the Pope was once asked by English Catholics, is it okay to kill a queen? And his answer was yes, because she's doing so much evil, only good is going to come out of her death. In fact, Pope Gregory XIII is quoted as saying, whoever sends Elizabeth I out of the world with pious intention of doing God service, not only does not sin, but such an action, killing the queen, gains merit. This was the stance that the Roman Catholic Church had during this time. Also during this time, if you've heard of Mary, Queen of Scots, this is when she becomes a thorn in Elizabeth's side. She goes up into Scotland, where they try to maneuver her to try to take and usurp the throne. She claims that she has the right royal blood that is better than Elizabeth's, because Elizabeth came from an unsanctioned union. Anne Boleyn should have never been married to the king, and so she, who has a relation, I think, with Henry VII or something like that, you have that connection. So she was technically next in line for the throne. If anything happened to Elizabeth, she was the next one. So there were all kinds of attempts at this point to try to take the throne. All of this led to a great divide where you have now laws being instituted against Catholicism during the Elizabethan England, and you now have persecution. It's not the same as Mary's reign of terror. She's not sending anyone to be burned at the stake, but there are imprisonments. But during the 20 years or so of this persecution, really there were less than, it says, 250 Catholics who died in prison during this time frame. So, in the same way that the Catholics were trying to win back the crown, they were also trying to win back the religion. Thus, the Douay-Rheims Bible, the Catholic Church created, their whole intent was to create an English version. And they say their whole purpose was to correct the corruptions whereby the heretics have so lamentably diluted almost the whole of our countrymen. In other words, they say the Protestant Bibles are messed up, they're corrupted, and we need to put out a Catholic Bible that is going to take over that and make things, I guess you could say, Catholic once again. The work was put under a guy named Gregory Martin. He completed 2 chapters a day, which is pretty good as far as translation goes. They published the New Testament in 1582. They actually had the whole thing done, but only the New Testament was published. And then the Old and New were published in 1609, 1610. The basis of this translation was not Greek or Hebrew, but Latin. They made a very clear declaration. Remember the Council of Trent that had taken place? The Council of Trent had declared that the Vulgate was the translation to be used in Catholic churches and in the Latin Catholic masses moving forward. They had doubled down on that, not just a few years before this. So when it came time to make an English translation, they said, we're not going to go to all of those Greek and Hebrew corrupted versions that are being used. We're going to use the official Vulgate. And so they began translation there. Really, as a side note, 1592, the Clementine Vulgate was put out, which was declared the greatest of all the versions of the Vulgate. So when they were working on this at the College of Douay, that's why Douay is there, it's a city, which is where a college was, where they were working on this. Rheims is a place where some of it was published. That's why it's called Douay-Rheims. It's not people, it's places where publishing took place. But when they were working on this, they were working with an inferior Latin text because that was prior to the Clementine Vulgate that was brought out in 1592. Because remember, 1582, or let me go back here. Yeah, 1582 was when they did this translation. All right, let's see, we're quickly running out of time. The whole point was to preserve the Latin above all else, which made things weird. Instead of translating a lot of things, they transliterated. You all know the difference between that? A transliteration is where you just go letter by letter for a word, like baptize. What does baptize mean? It means to immerse. So where does the word baptize come from? It comes from the Greek, baptizo, right? It's just a letter-for-letter transliteration instead of translation. So they transliterated a lot of Latin words, and I don't know Latin, so I don't know how to pronounce these, but longanity, inquination, corruption, supersubstantial bread, audible to God, concorporate and comparticipant. These are not words. You might think, well, yeah, but back then people used these words. No, they didn't. That was the point. There was a lot of weird language that was brought in, Phrases such as, purge out the old leaven that you may be a new paste, as you are enzymes. If thou be a prevaricator of the law, thy circumcision is become prepuce, or I don't know, prepuce. Just weird words. And the weird language brought forth more charges from the people saying, look, you're just trying to keep the Bible out of the common person's ability to understand. Interestingly enough, it's not entirely untrue. Look at what they say in their preface to the Douay-Rheims Bible. We must not imagine that in the primitive church, everyone was free to read, reason, dispute, turn and toss the scriptures, or that our forefathers suffered every schoolmaster, scholar, or grammarian that had a little Greek or Latin straight to take in hand the Holy Testament. Now, the primitive church, don't think that in the primitive church everybody read the scriptures. Don't think that back in the primitive church people actually talked about them and reasoned the scriptures together. That was for the elites. The elites were the ones who read them. Not just anybody, like a schoolmaster or just a grammarian who had a little bit of knowledge. You're not going to entrust them with all of the scripture, right? Keep on going. Or that the translated Bibles were in the hands of every husbandman, artificer, prentice, boy, girl, mistress, maid, man. Or that they were sung, played, alleged of every tinker, taverner, rhymer, minstrel, that they were table talk for ale benches, for boats and barges, or every profane person in company. The poor plowman could then, by the way, plowman, person that was used by, example by Luther or Tyndale, talked about putting it in the hands so a plowman could even read, right? Or that the poor plowman could then, in laboring the ground, sing hymns and psalms. In other words, the plowmen, they could sing hymns, they could sing psalms, but only as they heard them in the Holy Church, even though they could neither read nor know the sense or meaning of the mysteries of the same. In other words, they could sing the songs that they learned without even knowing what those songs meant. He says, don't think that the Bible is supposed to be in the hands of regular, everyday people. And this seems to be a translation that was given very specifically to make it difficult for the everyday, ordinary person to understand it. If you look at our date, 1610, we are right on the cusp of what? The authorized King James Version of 1611. Both of these come out almost right at the same time. And not next week, nor the week following. In a few weeks, we're going to pick up our discussion and move into talking about the greatest, most influential writing in the English language that's ever has been and most pertinent to us, and that is the translation of the Bible into English that we call the King James Version. All right, thanks a lot, guys. Good class.